being so proactive. You're right. My mind was focused on, I had technical glitches from hell. I couldn't even find this file today. It disappeared from my laptop. So I had to go searching through all these flash drives. I luckily had recorded from years back when I was just starting to use flash drives instead of Kodachrome slide carousel trays. If you don't know what those are, old school. So obviously that's not feasible. So it took me a while. I barely got all that stuff. I finally found what I needed. We have the slides we need that are from the syllabus. So thank you for reminding me of that. Obviously at this point, this lecture will be posted for those of you who missed part of it. Hopefully you don't miss much because it's really interesting stuff. Van Gogh is probably the most misunderstood artist. Oh, here we go. Of all of the post-impressionists. So let's get to the topic of post-impressionism. Let's go all the way through to around 4:15, might go slightly over, but then I'll stay, I always do, as long as necessary for any questions you may have after the slides. But you're going to notice something. I didn't cover the slides from last week of sculpture because we didn't have time. Rodin, I'm not going to skip him. He's too important. So what are we going to do about that? We are going to cover him probably after the second midterm. I'll do him at the beginning of 1 week from today when we move on to another topic, because he's an early modern sculptor. So he doesn't really fit into Impressionism anyway, which is where I put those slides. If you looked at your syllabus last week and you noticed I already said this, we'll have to cover him later. We have plenty to do today. So let's get started with today's slides of post-impressionism. So here we go. We have several definitions because post-impressionism is not a simplistic concept or an easy to understand one, but the good news is I made the definition simple, not simplistic. That would mean dumbing it down. I don't ever do that. You know that for any of my classes because they don't need to for anyone at this college. So here we go. I'm going to give you a definition that will be useful for you for any future interest you have in understanding the difference between Impressionism and paintings that came or a style of painting that came after Impressionism. It's a very misunderstood concept. For example, Van Gogh is not an Impressionist. He's constantly misidentified that way, even in some books, and certainly a lot of mass media has described him as, you know, an Impressionist. No, he was not. So here we go. He was a post-impressionist. So here's that definition. Pretty important. It's at the bottom of the list of terms from last week. We finished with Impressionism. Okay, here we go. It's not too long. The definition of post-impressionism is a general term for those painters who passed through an impressionist phase, comma, I'll say that again, a general term for those painters who passed through an impressionist phase, comma, and then created their own innovative and original styles, and then created their own innovative and original styles, period. Well, I'm sure most of you have taken critical thinking, right? Or logic, or what some class is required, right? My daughter's got to take that next semester. So you get from that definition that it doesn't tell us a thing about what styles are involved. It's a broad umbrella-like concept of all these groups of painters that were, and they all lived in France. It's where Impressionism started. We already covered that last week. So if they either moved to France or were from there, and they dabbled, Van Gogh briefly dabbled for like a few months. He did a couple of, well, more than a couple because he was so prolific. He probably did a dozen sort of rough studies of Impressionist type, and it wasn't what he wanted to do. So he left Paris and created his own new style. And there's no other word for Van Gogh style, but the Van Gogh style. However, if you've been looking ahead, I doubt you have, you guys are busy enough, but flipping to the next page. Now, does anybody need me to repeat that definition of post-impressionism? It's pretty straightforward. It's not likely to be a standalone question on the final. However, one of these next definitions, I'll do them as we go through the slides where they are relevant. Pointillism, building blocks of color, and synthetism. Those are specific styles invented by artists who were post-impressionist. So I hope you get that general concept of what we're doing here. Is we're starting out with the overview of what that concept is, which is just a broad term for artists that did their own thing, you could say, who created their own innovative and unique styles after experimenting with impressionism, or even some of them were full-time impressionists. So let's get started. This slide should be really familiar to any of you who saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off or otherwise perhaps have been to where it is on display, has a whole wall to itself. It's our first must know, and this slide is one I won't cut from the study list. Okay, it's on the top of our list for this week. Paris, a Rainy Day. That's the rough translation. In English, that's the English title. Paris, comma, a Rainy Day. The artist's name is Caillebotte, or as people in Indiana, my aunts and uncles would say, Calabati. It's French, of course. All these artists today, either they were French or they lived in France and became part of this post-impressionist movement. So Caillebotte is spelled Callebotte, Caillebotte. Paris, a Rainy Day, the title, the date 1877. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. That's why I alluded to there's one very, corny scene where the characters from the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off stands in front of this painting, or several of them stand in and have, I don't know how they get umbrellas into the museum. You wouldn't be allowed to bring an umbrella, let alone food. People have been following that. What idiots, those people that are trying to damage Van Gogh and Monet and other. What does that have to do with advancing climate change, measures and the need to do that? It's just idiotic. Yeah. Anyway, luckily, most of those paintings weren't actually damaged, although the one by Vermeer was. Hopefully that trend goes away. Anyway, yeah, you've been hearing about that. So it's been months now that people have been doing this in museums around the world because they're not thinking very clearly. Okay, so this painting is a post-impressionist painting for two reasons. Because Caillebotte was never fully part of the Impressionists. So this is the meaning now, right? Caillebotte, who was he? He was a partial, you can say a sometimes, there we go, intermittent, that's even a better word, intermittent, on again, off again, obviously come and go through, intermittent participant in the Impressionist movement. He did definitely use Impressionist techniques, and we're going to say what those are in just a couple of moments on this slide. But what we have is him as an early post-impressionist, because he decided he didn't want to strictly do impressionist painting. He wanted to mix, and he's famous for this. This is his signature motif. He would mix areas of very sharp realism. That should be obvious as you look at this, right? Painting, this couple walking toward us, and the man walking past who looks for all the world like the backside of Grover Cleveland, former president of the United States. There's three people there that are closest to us. They are clearly realistic. There's nothing impressionistic about them. Their umbrellas, their faces, their clothing are all very realistic. And then you could say the same of these two men crossing this, actually it's three men crossing the street in the middle ground, but in the background and even part of the foreground on the ground, literally, well, it's of course the street, cobblestone street, and a sidewalk, the sidewalk and the street, and all of the background are impressionistic. And so what these two things do, the areas within the same painting of impressionism and realism, give it a different look. It's not a strictly impressionist painting, but if someone categorized him as an impressionist, they wouldn't be completely wrong, because obviously a good part of this painting is exactly what we defined last week. And you definitely want to know that definition. The definition impressionist will come up for sure somehow on the final, where the areas are, on an overcast day where, excuse me, sorry. Excuse me, just give me a second. On an overcast day in, late November, probably around this time of year, you would see the light affecting the buildings and the street like this, or at least that's how Caillebotte, this painter, is conveying his impression of how the light hits these objects. But then he decides to just totally abandon impressionist techniques in the foreground of the people and the middle ground. I would call this the middle ground of these three men crossing the street. So he's famous for doing that. Also, his other signature motif is he almost entirely painted scenes within the city of Paris. Almost every other impressionist and then later post-impressionists went outside of the big cities into the countryside to do landscapes as well as urban scenes, both. He stuck to almost entirely urban scenes. He lived and worked almost his entire career in and around Paris. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning here. So now let's talk about the simulated texture. I already kind of touched on it, but if you didn't write that, now you should. Of course, it's super sharp and realistic on the umbrellas, the clothing, the face of the, actually it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 closest figures, the ones in the foreground and the middle ground. Everything else is soft and diffused because that part, the rest of everything, other than those 5 figures are, and the lamppost, that's realistic. But everything else is soft and diffused or implied simulated textures. And the modeling is obviously on all of the impressionist sections, very soft, very diffused, but sharp and strong on those same 5 figures. Lines are visible on those, again, 5 figures that are closest to us as outline, thin outline. But there's no lines on the rest of the painting, none, no outline of any kind. And of course, the largest mass is the street. And then I would say that couple kind of looks like a single mass because they're, you know, walking together arm in arm. And then maybe the man passing them after that. Okay, the rhythm, obviously the umbrellas, the cobblestone streets, the windows in the buildings, the arms, hands, and legs. It is mostly stable, although it looks dynamic because of this, you know, building that we're looking directly at, that the corner on that has diagonal lines because of course it fades into the distance. So this painting uses all the techniques for space, realistic techniques. It's got, of course, atmospheric perspective, diminishing size, people, of course, overlapping, foreshortening on all, everything practically, or all the objects along the street. And it does have scientific perspective. There's no question there's a vanishing point. So Caillabaut did that. He liked to keep the vanishing points and realistic techniques for space, even when he did, you know, mixtures of impressive realism. So that's another one of his signature motifs. He didn't abandon the use of scientific perspective the way most impressionists did. All right, and then we have no altered proportions or scale. The colors are almost all cool. It's a cool gray day. One of my friends wrote a book of poetry years ago. I haven't seen him in years, called about Paris and why he loved that city. He lived there for a long time with his future wife, and he called it the cool gray city of love. But then I heard that phrase said about San Francisco too, and one of San Francisco's columnists wrote that phrase. So Paris definitely has that cool feeling in the fall, late fall and winter. All right, there's a little bit of warm, of course, a hint of warm. Well, there's skin tones, obviously, and then on the edges of a couple of the buildings. Okay, and like I said, it's almost entirely stable except for the umbrellas and the diagonal lines of that one building. Let's move on now. Now we get to an artist who is considered the first post-impressionist painter. Okay, and this is a very important work. I won't cut it from the study list. Cézanne, Cézanne was his last name. Cézanne, Self-Portrait, 1879. So the best way to start on the meaning about who was Cézanne is he was the first fully post-impressionist painter. He had done impressionist paintings earlier, years earlier. He was a part of the impressionist movement, which means he literally worked with the impressionists and they exhibited together. That's what Caillabaut did too, but not every year. Cézanne was with the impressionists fully for many years, and then he decided he wanted to move on to something different. And he, therefore, the other fact about him is many artists, including Picasso, called him the father of modern art. That's not overstating the case. He is the first fully post-impressionist painter, and just say many artists and historians, both today as well as back then, call him or consider him to be the father of modern art. Why? Because he invented a new way of looking at reality that was an inspiration to all the abstract painters of the 20th century. I'll say that again. Without him, there wouldn't have been modern painting. Picasso probably would never have done what he did. He said that. Picasso said that directly. He knew Cezanne. Cezanne died, way back around 1910 or so, but they knew each other when Picasso lived in Paris as a young artist. So I'll say it again. The reason that Cezanne is considered to be by many, just say many people, to be the first modern, or the father even of modern painting, let's just say painting, is because he invented a new way of looking at reality. And that way of looking, that his style, it's called building blocks of color. I'll give you the definition in a minute. So his style, the Cezanne style, called building blocks of color, inspired all of the other modern movements after him in, you got to say, Western painting. Again, we're talking about Europe and North America at this point. So again, he inspired artists in the 20th century who became the first abstract painters. So he's like what, a bridge, a connecting link, however you want to say it, between realism and the Renaissance and Impressionism, which breaks many rules of Renaissance realism. We already covered that last week. And yet he isn't fully abstract, because you can recognize actual objects like himself and a window and his jacket in this painting, this self-portrait. So let's talk about here's the definition of this new style that he invented. It's his own creation. No one had ever thought of before. Again, it's on your list of terms to know: building blocks of color. It's a style of painting invented by Cezanne, and then it was imitated by many other painters. A style of painting invented by Cezanne, in which firmly placed brushstrokes of alternating warm and cool colors. You see, as I'm going here, it goes warm, cool, warm, cool, warm, cool. I'll say it again: firmly placed, brushstrokes of alternating warm and cool colors are used, combined with a bold outline. Look at his head. You see that here, the bold outline around the top of his bald head there, of course, and around his jacket, shoulders at least. But his face is what the focus is. The building blocks of color are the main idea. That is a new concept that Cezanne came up with. In other words, he's breaking objects down into geometric segments, but he's not literally doing that where Picasso did that. Of course, he made human bodies look like shards of glass. We'll get to him, of course, and other abstract painters. So he's not quite abstract. You can tell this is a real human being with, two eyes and, a normal face and normal shaped head, two shoulders, right? Is he in front of a window? But see, we don't know what the background is. So that's one other thing that isn't a part of the definition I just gave you of building blocks of color, but it's a signature motif of most of Cezanne's paintings. Once he invented this new technique, this is the first modern portrait. I should have started with that, but it doesn't matter if you get it in your notes now. That's how this is described. Nobody debates that one. No, everyone agrees this is the first modern portrait, because it uses that style or technique he created called building blocks of color, and it breaks down the way light and an actual object looks in different light with the different building blocks of color. It's not the same as Impressionism, although some people might not yet be clear why it's different. But look carefully. It's not a soft and diffused look, and it's not one that only uses little diffused areas of color. It's sharp and firmly placed, these brushstrokes. And when you look at each individual brushstroke, if you squint, as my father used to teach me, he was a pretty successful commercial artist, at any work of art, you can get an idea of how the composition works, or what it's made up of. It's made of building blocks of color, literally alternating warm and cool color. No one had ever thought of doing that. He did that not only on portraits, that this is the first modern portrait, but he was doing it on landscapes. You'll see that in the next slide of one of his other paintings. So he did it on interior views, portraits, still lifes. He's famous for the baskets of apples and oranges. Some of you have seen those of Cezanne's, still life. So he did it on every kind of painting once he invented this technique. But this is the first portrait in which he used that technique. So that's why this is considered to be the first modern portrait. The background, we're not supposed to know or even care what it is. It could be a stained glass window. It could be wallpaper. It could be a medicine cabinet, or it could just be geometric pattern he liked to use just, for the background to place him at least somewhere inside. We're pretty sure that's the only thing we can tell, that he's in a room of some kind. But it could be this is the window, and outside that could be the sky. We don't know, but at least he's in front of some kind of a background which was solid and has a geometric pattern. But we're not supposed to be concerned with what it is, whether it's a window or wallpaper or anything else. Okay, that's the whole meaning. We already covered the warm and cool aspects. Of course, it's mostly cool in the background here, right, and on his jacket, but his face, or his whole head is pretty much, even the beard has alternating areas of warm and cool if you look closely. There is the bold outline, I already mentioned that, of course. And then we have the only technique for space. Well, there's some foreshortening on his shoulder, yeah, and overlapping. That's it. No other techniques for space. He's almost dead center, so it's balanced. But if you count this as empty space, I mean, we don't know. That could be some other, part of the wall or pattern of, colors or paint or wallpaper. But if it's sky, then some people think of it as weighted because there's something solid in the background, somewhat unbalanced toward the right. I wouldn't argue, but definitely it's roughly balanced top to bottom because of the areas covered here. If you draw the line around at the bottom of his nose, he's the largest mass, then the background. There's only really two masses. It's almost entirely stable. The only thing's dynamic, obviously the top of every human being's head pretty much are right, always portrayed, if they're realistically shown, as curved. So that's dynamic, but it's a detail. His pose, he's looking straight at us, even the way his shoulders are aligned. It's true the background has diagonal lines, but then it's also got a straight edge. So to me, it seems more stable than dynamic, but you could just say it's both. There's no altered proportions or scale here. And of course, the rhythm is obvious. The two eyes, the jacket itself, and the pattern, and the background, and the beard. Oh, I didn't, the one I just say, is this balanced? Most people would say it isn't because of the weight of the three closest figures. So I wouldn't dispute that. So it's unbalanced. This again is the first slide if you joined us afterwards, right? Paris, a rainy day. So it's unbalanced toward the right. And it's up to you to decide if this amounts to, which it is mass, the street, cobblestones on the street are solid mass. Then you would have to say it's roughly balanced top to bottom. Okay, let's move on now. This is the next must know. And it's also by Cezanne. Yes, please go ahead. Question?
What about modeling and texture for the self-portrait?
Right. Thanks again. That's always welcome input. Yeah, the modeling here is soft and diffused, but it is realistic. In that, you see the folds of his jacket is, around his collar, and of course around his eyes. So there is some modeling, you'd have to say, and yet it's soft and diffuse, but realistic. Simulated texture, no, it's just implied. It's implied in that regard is similar to what an impressionist painting would do. In fact, you'll see more of those two aspects of his use of simulated textures and modeling in this painting. Actually, I prefer this painting. I like that other one, but this one, I'm not saying yet if either one or the other will be on the final, but there's a fairly good chance, at least 50-50. This is her next must know. Same artist, Cezanne, Cezanne. And this one is Mont, that's French for mountain, of course, Mont. And then the name of the mountain, it's hyphenated, is Sant, that means saint, Sante, Victoire, capital Victorie, 1898. This is one of a series of paintings that not only Cézanne, but many other painters in France at that time who lived in France would paint this mountain, because look how distinct the shape is. It's very jagged. You see that? And it's a very distinct looking mountain, in the vein of what the Matterhorn, sort of the real one, not the one Disneyland, which I got to fly around in a 1930s airplane and almost reach out and touch the snow. No exaggeration. Swiss tourism. I arranged for some journalists from California to come to Switzerland and do that. Now, of course, I don't know if they'd still do that. Anyway, you can get close to this mountain, or you can, this is what Cézanne did many times. So in other words, this is part of a series of paintings by Cézanne, and other painters also did this, but he's probably the first one to show the mountain from different angles, not different times of day. That's a Monet thing we covered. Remember how Monet did that with landscapes in his Impressionist painting. This is not Impressionist. I know people look at this and they'll start to think that, but if you're now starting to get the concept, I hope, after that first slide of the self-portrait, of what is different about the building blocks of color. Well, you see that here on the mountain. Look at these brush strokes, right? Of warm and cool alternating. And then it's even more obvious. In fact, it jumps out at you on the face of the cliffs. That is a quarry, an abandoned rock quarry, which was a popular foreground setting for painters, Cézanne and others, who painted this mountain from different angles, because it was huge. And I imagine it went for, I don't know, maybe a mile or so around the edge of the mountain. So he's painting the trees, the mountain, and the cliff or face of the rock quarry with the same technique of building blocks of color. It's more obvious on the trees in the ones on the upper half, because there you see the alternating blocks of color. But if you squint, you start to notice that, yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's almost more like real, a scene like this would look in real life. But you can see how it breaks down each section, like the rock quarry or cliff face, if you use either phrase, the trees, at least in the upper half, and the mountain for sure, breaks it down into different blocks of color that are not, as straightforward and realistic, even though you can tell it's a mountain with trees and rocks and, cliff in front of it. So I think you get the idea, hopefully by now, of why he's considered the father of modern painting by so many artists and historians, because he's, looking at reality in a new way no one had thought of. Picasso himself said, without Cézanne, I think he even said it, almost a direct quote, there would be no modern painting. And he didn't live that long. He died, I think, his early 50s. Anyway, so the bold outline is the final part of, the second. I mean, you see that on the mountain and on the top of at least parts of the cliffs. I guess less so on this segment, but you see it here on the rest of the quarry, right? And of course, these trees are closer to us, so he's not using so much of the building blocks of color on those trees, but everything else, and the vast majority of this landscape, has that technique. Okay, and we already know enough about who Cézanne was, so let's just do the formal analysis. This is balanced. Oh yeah, I think so. Although there's some people who think because one of these trees he painted going up into the, upper right corner, it almost is taller than the top of the mountain, or certainly than this set of trees. But the sky has texture too, and therefore, I would say mass. To me, it's balanced left to right and top to bottom, roughly, of course. The largest mass would be the cliff face or rock quarry. That's what it really is. Where they used to dig for, I don't know, marble or whatever other kind of stone people need to build houses or make statues out of. So it's an abandoned rock quarry. That would be the largest mass. Then the mountain, and then it's a close call. But if you count this as one mass, it's really a group of trees. I guess that would be the third largest mass. The rhythm is obvious with the edges of the cliff faces and the trees having roughly, not exactly, you got to say very rough about, but there is some overall sense. But actually, the rhythm is also created by the building blocks of color themselves. So it has rhythm in two ways. I already mentioned the bold outlines. And then here there is diffused modeling but it's less obvious than on that portrait, because the only places I see it clearly used modeling, I mean, are on the trees, and even there it's not sharp. It's realistic, but it's not sharp. It's realistic yet diffused. And here, there again, there's no simulated texture. It's just implied. And let's see, stable or dynamic. Well, this is a mixture, because the cliffs, right, or rock quarry face of the quarry, that's pretty stable, but the mountain, the trees are dynamic, and that's a majority of the painting, so it's mostly dynamic. There's no distorted proportions or scale here. And the colors are warm on the rock face or cliff face, cool, of course, mostly cool on the trees and the sky, and a mixture almost equally of warm and cool on the mountain, which is the focus of this. Okay. Now we get to another painting that you may have seen. I think it also was in a scene, in the same scene, I mean, in a different room of the Art Institute of Chicago. They own this and the first painting we saw, the Paris Street Rainy Day. This is one of the most famous paintings ever in the last, well, 2 centuries anyway.
How about space techniques for that last one?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, it's hard to tell. There could be scientific perspective. It's possible. I don't think so, though. He wasn't known to use it, so I doubt it. So it's unlikely to have scientific perspective, because the trees and things don't necessarily have to line up, right? So it probably doesn't have that. I don't think there's atmospheric perspective. Just because there's a bit of blue, that's his alternating blocks of warm and cool color technique. It's not about the, so I don't see either atmospheric or scientific perspective, but obviously it has diminishing size. And I would say some foreshortening, a little bit, minimal though, on the top of the cliffs here. So really it's overlapping and diminishing size are the main techniques for space. Okay. All right, this is the next must know. I'm not cutting this for sure from the study list. A very important work, and it's Seurat, Seurat, a Sunday on La Grande Jatte. It would be how the French pronounce it. A Sunday on La, of course, is La Grande, right? Has an E on the end, and then Jatte means jetty, is spelled in French Jatte. 1886. Well, who the painter was is part of the importance of the meaning of this. This painter Seurat invented a new technique, yet another post-impressionist technique, and that's got a definition that isn't too difficult here. It's at the top of the same page where we just did the building blocks of color definition. So that's an important one. It could easily appear on the final. Pointillism was a style of post-impressionist painting invented by Seurat, a style of post-impressionist painting invented by Seurat, in which thousands of tiny dots of color were used on all the objects, in which thousands of tiny dots of color were used on all the objects, which were supposed to blend in the eye of the viewer, period. It didn't work out that way. You can see the spots when people look at this. I've been to this museum so many times since I started teaching this class. I always wait till a class of art students goes and tries to recreate this, because it's a very popular painting for, an exercise for painters. If they can get to that museum, standing in front of it, and they'll say, "Oh man, I see all those bloods. You see them here in the trees. You see them on the grass. You see them in the human figures here. The mother, the trumpeter, this couple here, rather distinguished looking, and then these 2 young ladies probably talking about whether or not he loves me not. That's an old-fashioned thing. Anyway, what the scene depicts isn't what's important, but it's part of the meaning, so you should add this. It depicts a Sunday afternoon in a small park in the middle of the river. You don't have to say which river, but if you want to know, it's the only river in Paris, the Seine, Seine. So you can just say it's a park, a small park in the middle of the river in Paris, in which middle-class couples, that's who these people are, are coming to relax, to do whatever, play a trumpet, bring their pet dog or monkey. You see the monkey here, take a walk with their daughter or their child, just sit back and relax, have a smoke, whatever. It's what people would do normally on a Sunday afternoon in this part of Paris, which was a middle class section. By the way, this island, you don't have to write this, is where the Statue of Liberty was first displayed in 1/4 scale. It's still there. The model for the Statue of Liberty, the big one, of course, is obviously in New York, was created, I think everyone knows, as a gift from the French government. Pretty nice of them, huh? And that's on a bridge that leads to this island. And the statue is pretty impressive. It's about 1/4 the size of the actual. You could put that down as you want to, but that's not part of the point of the painting. The painting is just displaying people relaxing in middle class families and couples enjoying the good life that they now can have, because they didn't used to have the wherewithal, right? They couldn't afford to relax like this and go to a park and just enjoy the day. So there's a deeper meaning than that, except that the style is revolutionary. It did change for many people. There's still people that teach this style of painting, and I've seen paintings in art galleries with this technique. But the point is, it didn't actually work the way he intended. Look closely, and you can see the thousands of tiny dots of color, even in the most solid looking objects like this woman's dress. And yes, even look carefully, you see them there? Reds, blues, purples, they're still all visible when you look closely. So it didn't quite work out the way he intended. The dots of color are still visible in most areas of all of his paintings, but it was so popular that it started a whole new trend. Many artists imitated this, or adapted, you could say, adopted this style directly after his success. He died at 31, or they just say in his early 30s, it might have been 32. And it was from tuberculosis. This is part of the meaning, and many historians believe it's because of what he was doing. Can you imagine how long this painting took? Over a year and a half for him to finish. That's another part of me. These paintings took a long time. It's just the big landscape versions. He did this technique on, still lifes, and I don't know about portraits, but, indoor scenes. But when he did it on a large scale like this, it took him over a year. And he had to get up on a ladder. And yes, paint was toxic back then. I don't know if it still is, oil paint. It was very dangerous. Van Gogh almost killed himself once by ingesting tubes of paint. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. He's our next must-know artist. So just say that this artist, died very young. Many historians believe because he caught tuberculosis from breathing the fumes of his own paint, the toxic fumes. We don't know that for sure, but it could easily have been. An occupational hazard is what you call it. But by the time he died, he was already world famous. His paintings were being shown and sold all over the Western world, and he was imitated by many painters still to this day. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning, except for one last thing I would like to say. There are some critics, I've even seen in some textbooks, who pan this painting, who denigrate it, whatever you want to say, criticize and say, oh, it's so stiff and formal. We're going to do the formal elements in a minute. The posing. My battery is low. What? I had plugged this in. That was one of the. Yeah, this comes out. The cord does that on its own. Take a second. There we go. That should take care of it. Yeah. I made sure it was plugged in when we started. Now it is again. So let's just hope it doesn't work its way loose again. It should. All right. So the point is, there are critics who see this painting as stiff, formal, and lifeless. I can't disagree more. I couldn't disagree more. I grew up with this painting. My parents would take me and my brothers to this museum at least twice a year to see different new exhibits. And our favorite paintings, and this was always one of them, it's what the middle class Victorian, it was a Victorian era, people did dress like and how they'd behave in public. But they are relaxing. You can see that if you look closely. So I don't agree with that criticism at all. It's just the time and the setting that are so different than what you might see in a modern Sunday afternoon park setting in a big city in either Europe or the US. You'd see a very different, set of, activities. But It isn't, I don't think, at all stiff and lifeless. I don't agree, but that's up to each individual interpretation. Okay, form analysis. Well, it is pretty stable. You don't see much dynamic here, very little, only the details, the umbrellas. The figures are sitting or standing upright, but that's how they would behave in public at this point in time. I mean, maybe the very tops of this one tree's branches, but even the scene behind them, the quay, it's called the quay or quay. I never say that word, right? The edge of the river, and the boats and most of the tree trunk, it's almost all stable. It's roughly balanced, carefully so. This group here is almost the same size as this couple here. And even though they're lower than that couple, when you add in this group and the tree, and if you squint, and then the dead center is the mother with the daughter, it's roughly balanced. I'd say both left to right and top to bottom. Of course, the rhythm is obvious. The human bodies, heads, hands, umbrellas. There is no line, not a single line anywhere in this painting. None. It's all done with dots of color. But there is soft and diffuse modeling, most noticeable on the figures to the, the couple, I should say, to the far right. That's done with, different shades of dots of color, right? So it's got fairly realistic and yet still soft modeling. The simulated texture here, again, there is none, not really. It's just implied, but of course it's done so carefully that with the placement of the warm and cool colors, which of course it's warm on the most of the skin tones, and it's cool on the grass in the foreground, but then the sun makes the middle area of the grass and the trees more yellow than green, so that's warm. The water's cool, of course, you see it's a mixture of warm and cool, so it does have implied texture, but it's not realistic or sharp at all. Simulated textures, really is no simulated textures. There's no altered proportions or scale here. For space, this has scientific perspective, and I would say that's atmospheric perspective on the shoreline across the river. And of course, for shortening, diminishing size, and overlapping, again, you guys can do much of this, I think, by now on your own. So I'll try to just do, say, 6 to 8 of the 10 elements on each. But please ask, like you've been doing, if there's any that you don't hear me do and want me to comment on. Okay, the largest mass, well, you can say it's the grass, the ground. And then this couple, they, to me, appear to be a single mass. And then maybe this group, because they overlap. Of course, again, we have overlapping for shortening, diminishing size. I think I already said that, right? And there is a vanishing point, scientific perspective. Let's see. Am I forgetting a thing? I think we covered it. Textures. Okay, now we get to an artist who I think everybody has a strong opinion about, mostly a kind of almost tragic sense of who he was, and they'd be right in almost everything you've heard about Van Gogh, with one big exception. He did not cut his ear off and send it to a prostitute. We'll get to that, but this is one of the two Van Gogh must-knows. Van Gogh, of course, everyone knows how to spell his name, I think, right? 2 words, of course, Van Gogh. The other, well, I'll spell a second part of his name. It's Dutch, G-O-G-H, Van Gogh. Wheat, the title of this first must-know, is Wheat Field with Cypress Trees, 1889. So what can we say about Van Gogh in a short time we have? Well, let's start with the fact that he only sold one painting during his lifetime, one painting right before he died. His brother was an art dealer. That's not a minor detail. We wouldn't know all the meaning of his paintings if it weren't for the fact that his brother believed in him and tried to get, can you imagine how these people felt once they realized Van Gogh's paintings after he died became worth more than anything else in any other art gallery for sale, but they were too stupid to buy them when he was alive. Yeah, I always thought that's ironic. Yeah, but he sold only one painting in his lifetime, so he did not have success during his lifetime. He did get some critics starting right before he died, like less than a year before he died, starting to say he was a genius. Some of them got it. They want to see young, rather avant-garde, right? You know that word, right? Avant-garde is a good French term. Kinds of critics who didn't just go to the mainstream galleries, but looked at new painters like Van Gogh. So what was it about Van Gogh's style that caught on. Well, he was a post-impressionist. That's a really important thing, but there's no other way to describe his style except to call it, so in your notes now I'll give you a definition of what it means to say the Van Gogh style. It didn't actually create as much of an imitation, group of painters imitating it as either Seurat or Cezanne, but it did influence almost every kind of landscape. He was mostly a landscape painter, but of course he did portraits and still lifes. But he's most famous for landscapes. So what is the Van Gogh style that he created? It's one of the post-impressionist styles. Okay, so it had three main features. Okay, first, a writhing or undulating effect on all the main objects. There's no other way to say it. Everything from the wheat itself to the sky has a writhing or undulating effect. I mean, nothing is just still. Even the two cypress trees, look carefully, kind of curl upward into the sky, and the clouds, look at them, and the mountains in the background. So again, the first feature of the Van Gogh style, he created off of these things. They were totally original ideas that he came up with, was a writhing and undulating effect on all the main objects. Okay, the second thing is a bold outline combined with realistic modeling. So he did not do the soft diffuse modeling that we've seen, at least not on the foreground or middle ground. In this painting, you can see the wheat is pretty realistic, isn't it? The trees, the bushes, especially the two cypress trees, even the mountains. So the bold outline combined with realistic modeling is another element of his unique style, the Van Gogh style. The third one is the hardest one to explain. He had his own color theory. There are books written about it. But we don't have time for that. So all we can talk about are the three main colors that he used, among many others. Of course, he didn't limit himself to these. There were three colors among his color theory, his own color theory, that he used to symbolize different feelings or emotions. So I'll say it again. He had a very complex theory of color that he created, but the most important colors, there were three of them that he used to symbolize various human emotions or feelings. Okay, so what were those? Well, yellow and shades of yellow or gold, which would be the wheat field itself. Let's go up here. Those symbolize the positive human emotions like love, friendship, happiness. Again, yellow or various shades of yellow and gold in his theory symbolized the positive human emotions like love, acceptance, happiness, even friendship, those kind of emotions, which he had very little of. The only person that believed in him, his own parents turned their back on him. They said he was crazy and they didn't want to have anything to do with him after a few years. Even after he, started to show some talent, they didn't even want to know about it, but his brother did. So he had almost none of those positive human emotions in his own life, but he portrayed them through the use of the colors of yellow and gold in his paintings. This second of his three main techniques of color theory, or examples of color theory, would be green and shades of green, which symbolize the negative human emotions like fear, anger, greed, hatred, things like that. Fear, anger, greed, hatred, and other negative human emotions. And then finally, the third main or most important colors, but like I said, he didn't limit himself to this theory, was very broad, but he emphasized these three colors in all his landscapes, would be blue, and shades of blue would symbolize a divine presence. That's part of the meaning of who he was. He was the son of a minister who tried to become a Christian, right, minister. And he was fired from his job because he cared too much about the coal miners who were treated like dirt. I don't know if you know how coal miners were treated in the 1800s. It's not a lot better now. There's still, of course, coal miners all over the world, though coal is going to become less common. as we fight global warming. But the point is, coal miners were in a district where he went, and he lived with them in their homes, and he got fired. Maybe that's the best thing could have happened, because he never would have become a painter probably without that. He had already been doing drawings, but he hadn't become a painter. When he lost his job, in other words, as a want to be, he hadn't been ordained yet, right? But he was training to become a minister. He was fired by his superiors for being too close to the people he was supposed to help, right? The exact opposite of what, the Bible would say to do. But anyway, the point is, he left that a possible future profession, and then he started becoming a full-time painter. He painted nearly 3,000 paintings, 2,700 paintings. That's rounding off. And most of them he wrote letters about to his brother. That's how we know what he meant by each one, including the letters he wrote about his own color theory and his techniques that I just gave you. So this painting was done when he was probably here's the final part of the meaning of this, and then the next one we won't need to say as much about, but the second must know is even more famous, of course, the Starry Night. But what we can say about his mental condition that we know is today, almost certainly he would have been diagnosed as bipolar or having manic depression. The two terms are pretty much synonymous. So he was a victim of an inherited illness, mental illness, which of course is very difficult. Back then there was no medications for it. So he was, obviously his whole life was difficult. And so he would go, as bipolar sufferers do, back and forth between highs and lows. And that is what some people think about this painting. Now, there's no way to say for sure, because they didn't even have that term back then. They did have a term for clinical depression, but it isn't just that. He would be very upbeat and high when he was on the high end of those bipolar swings. So it's possible this painting, because if you're a rapid cycler, right, you go back and forth. Some people do, if they have manic depression, between the highs and lows. And for what we know, he did. He was one of those rapid cycling bipolar people. Even within the same 2 or 3 days it would take him a day to 3 days usually to paint a painting. And that's pretty amazing right there. He can finish a whole landscape in 1 to 3 days. He could have gone, while he's doing the painting, back and forth more than once between the highs and the lows, and that may or may not be the bottom line about why he used a mixture of the warm color of the yellow on the wheat and the greens on the middle ground and the blues in the mountains and the sky. Okay, formal analysis. Well, I just described the colors, like you can see, which are warm and cool, and the bold outlines. And the realistic modeling is on the middle ground here and on the wheat, but in the background, it's diffused. He often did that with the background. The mountains or buildings in the distance would sometimes have soft and diffuse modeling, but it's still realistic. Bold outlines on all the main objects, of course. This is so carefully balanced. At first glance, people think, oh, it's unbalanced because the trees are tall. No, look at the sky. The sky has absolute weight, and it was meant to be a roughly balanced. You look at this group of clouds that all overlap. That's almost the same area as these two trees. It's no accident. And then the sky and the land also take about almost exactly half each of the total canvas is covered by the sky, and the other half by the ground or earth. So he's very talented at doing rough but carefully calculated balances. I don't think there's a scientific, he didn't use scientific space. He did sometimes, but rarely. So there's no vanishing point, but he does have overlapping, of course, of the objects, foreshortening, diminishing size. And here there's atmospheric perspective clearly on the mountains, of course. And it is dynamic. I don't think there's a single landscape of his that isn't entire. I mean, there's no straight lines in it anywhere. It's all dynamic. The largest mass, you decide. If the clouds, the sky in general counts as single mass, that'd be the largest. If not, then it's close call, probably the wheat field, and then maybe the mountain or the two cypress trees if you count them as together. There's no distorted proportions or altered scale here. Okay, and of course it's obvious the rhythm, right, with the trees and the clouds and the mountains. Okay, this is his most famous painting, and it's become a cliche almost, but it still bears a little bit of explanation. Don't have to repeat who he was, right, and what he dealt with, his mental condition. But I do need to say about the meaning of this painting. It's, of course, Van Gogh, Starry Night, the Village, 1889. Starry Night, the Village. Now, this is the last time I checked. Yeah, it's at the museum in Paris, the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist, all in one big museum there, Musée d'Orsay. But we have the letters. That's how we know what he was thinking. So what does this show? It shows the view outside the window of his room, which he was locked in at night, at least for the first few months, after he did not cut his ear off. As part of the meaning, you probably should add to the notes on this slide in case it's on the exam. He cut his ear lobe off. Now that's self-damaging, of course. And so it obviously was in a fit of depression. After an argument with Gauguin. That's not a minor detail. Gauguin goaded him. Well, maybe his name made it inevitable. Gauguin was an egomaniac, insensitive and arrogant. Just the opposite of what Van Gogh was. Hypersensitive, not arrogant. And that's not a small detail. That's an important fact that incident where he cut his earlobe, not his whole ear, was nothing to do about a prostitute. It was after an argument with Gauguin when Gauguin trashed his paintings and said he wasn't. They were living together. I guess I should have started with that. And his brother, Van Gogh's brother, was paying all of their bills. And how does Gauguin repay the courtesy and kindness of both Vincent and his brother, in taking him in and giving him a place rent-free? He, trashes the work of Vincent's painting. It's terrible. The man was nasty, but he was a genius. We'll get to him as our last must know in just a couple minutes. So let's say the meaning of this painting is during a moment of peace and calm, which he didn't have a lot of, after he committed himself, it was his own choice, to an asylum, by which you can interpret however you want, but it's not like you think of, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, not that kind of stuff. It was a religious convent where they tried to help people with mental issues, but they didn't know how. All they could do is pray and give them food and quiet. He got better for a while. And so he's painting a scene here at night, of course, the village down below, it was on a hill, this asylum where he was living, being taken care of by nuns. He would paint a lot of landscapes in the daytime, but this is one of his few nighttime landscapes in which he sees the sky as a sign of God's love. In fact, in his letter to his brother, here's the last thing to say about the meaning of this. He said that blue, remember, is the color of a divine presence, and yellow is the color of warm human emotions like love and friendship and acceptance and happiness. He's saying God's love watches over us even while we sleep. That's not a direct quote, but it's paraphrase one of the lines in the letter he wrote about this painting to his brother. So we don't have to guess. There are all kinds of false interpretations of this painting over the years in many students' papers, I've noticed. I don't know why other people would make false. Yeah, all you have to do is read those letters. They've been published in multiple languages, there are whole books of them. There were hundreds of them that he wrote to his brother about, sometimes 2 or 3 paintings in one letter, or a single letter about paintings for maybe weeks. And that's why we know what Van Gogh's intentions were. So this has his color theory. The only thing slightly negative are the cypress trees, but they're off to the side and they don't dominate the painting. What dominates it is the sky and the village itself, with the yellow and the lights of the homes and buildings in the town below, and of course in the sky above, the moon and the stars. And the undulates, everything else I already covered. What makes this Van Gogh style is very obvious, with the bold outline and the realistic modeling, at least on the ground. And of course, the swirling, undulating motions and the color theory I've already mentioned. So, okay, here we go. Formal analysis, pretty obvious dynamic. Again, there's nothing stable about this. Bold outline around all the main objects. It is roughly balanced, except some people would say the sky does take up more space here than the foreground or the ground itself. But I would say it's still roughly balanced because this is a separate mass here of the undulating, swirling energy of the universe, or God's energy in the sky. He used more often, a divine presence but he did use the word God too when he wrote about his own painting sometimes. So you can say either word, the presence of that, either God or higher power in the sky would be some, or the energy of that higher power. I see it as roughly balanced both ways, left to right and top to bottom. Of course, we've got the rhythm of the houses, the cypress trees, the stars, and swirling sky. And for this one, there's overlapping and foreshortening, I would say, on some of the houses, and definitely diminishing size. But that's it. It's a nighttime view, so you can't say it as atmospheric perspective. And then he didn't use that perspective much. And there's no distorted mass. Not really. You might think that because of the sky, but that's symbolic. It's not really an object per se. Okay, and the colors are mostly cool on the ground with some warm in some of the houses, and cool in the sky, but warm mixture, I should say, with the yellows and golds of the stars. Some think they're planets or stars, and the moon. Okay, our last must-know artist. Yeah, we're going to be able to do this on time. This is a pretty important painting. I'm not cutting it from the study list. The man I just mentioned who drove Van Gogh to cut off his earlobe, Gauguin, Gauguin. Vision After the Sermon, 1888. Vision After the Sermon. Who was he? Well, our last new definition is the style he invented, synthetism. It's right there, so I don't need to spell for you, right below building blocks of color. Synthetism was a style of post-impressionist painting invented by Gauguin, which portrayed abstract concepts rather than literal reality. Which portrayed abstract concepts rather than literal reality. So it's another one of those early modern styles. But in his case, he was focusing on things that he felt or believed were important. And he wasn't trying to convey a real scene, even though he used objects from real life, like these women. They're not nuns, don't write, they had nothing to do with that. They are peasant women in rural France. This is the meaning now, who came home, were walking home from church, one of whom, I think it would be this one, but it doesn't matter, just say one of them had a vision. That's what the title tells us. Where she's, what is he saying? Well, he's saying it's a hallucination. No, she had no such vision. She was imagining it. So he's portraying an abstract concept of mass hallucination. That's the safest, shortest way to say what's the concept he's portraying. He's ridiculing these women. He didn't believe in anything. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in, the country. Well, actually, he was born in Peru, but he was a citizen of France. He didn't believe in any kind of higher power or higher meaning. He was a cynic, no question. He said so himself. And so he's, you could say, taking a cynical or critical, satirical is okay too, because he is satirizing these women. They thought they saw an angel come down from heaven, the one with the golden wings, wrestling with a saint in the middle of a cow pasture. There's a cow walking. And obviously he's not portraying literal reality, because I've never seen grass that color, grass or hay. I mean, that's the most intense red I think I've seen in any painting up to this point in the history of painting. I love that color, but it's not a realistic color for what the ground would look like, of course, any more than the idea of them being actually visually present during during a vision, which would ask where would it come from, but God, right? Showing them a scene with an angel come down from heaven wrestling with a saint who'd been dead for who knows how long. Saints by definition are dead, right? Catholics, right? These are all Catholics in France at this time. So this is a completely imaginary scene that he is mocking, you could say, or ridiculing, that these women believe they saw, because one of them said she saw it, and then the others all convinced themselves they saw it. And he's saying it's just a mass hallucination. That's his abstract concept. But he also had techniques, signature motifs, such as bold outlines with soft but strong modeling. You see that here on their headdresses and even on their faces. So bold outlines among, at least around the human figures, right? And soft but strong modeling. And then we see bold and vivid colors. Look at the, I mean, I already said that with the grass, but you also see it on this purple tree trunk. I guess it's purple. That certainly looks purple to me. That's not likely to be the actual color of the tree trunk, wherever it was that they stopped to see this. And then, of course, the gold on the wings of an angel. What does the color of an angel's wings look like? We don't know. He's just imagining it. So bold and imaginative colors, and unrealistic, I should say, bold and unrealistic colors are another part of his signature motif. And then there is the final thing would be that he is already, part of it is the definition you already have, which is his technique. I mean, his painting style, he called it synthetism. He created that term, the concept, and a lot of people then were inspired by that movement that he started. He was successful during his lifetime, quite successful. His painting sold for a good amount of money. He moved out of France and lived for a while in Tahiti, right, and other South Pacific islands, of different islands that were French colonies at that time in the South Pacific. We'll talk about that with the last must know, which let's get to that. This is dynamic. It's roughly balanced. I think you guys could, it's got overlapping. I guess you could say foreshortening, overlapping, diminishing size, and foreshortening. There's no other techniques for space. Here, it's up to you to decide if the proportions or scale, scale between the figures. I mean, if this cow is wandering into the field, then why is, the saint and the angel so big, like 3 times the size of a cow? So maybe he's distorting the scale of the wrestling angel, and I think so, and the saint, making them larger than they would be if they were actual figures, human size figures. I already mentioned the bold outlines, right? And the colors warm on the grass, or there's not really grass, you can say the ground, and the wings that cool on the tree trunk, the blue of the white of the headdresses, and the blue mostly of the dresses of the figures. And it is full of the rhythm of human bodies. And of course, it's almost all dynamic. I don't see a straight line in it. The largest mass, you decide, is these one mass here, these 2 closest to us, or maybe even the 3, that's up to you. And then maybe the tree trunk would be the next largest. And then the wrestling saint and angel. Okay, our last must know. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago again, and it's at the bottom of our list for today. Gauguin, already spelled right. Day of the God, 1894. So I already said who he was, so I don't have to repeat that. But I do want to make sure you know 1 or 2 facts in case, I'm not saying I won't cut this, but in case it might appear on the final, and which is this. Gauguin went to Tahiti, and then he took advantage, there's no other way to say it, of the local population, in that he had numerous, there's no other word for it, sexual relations with some of the youngest females in each of the villages. He lived in, I think, 3 different parts of the South Pacific, Tahiti, I think 2 different places. Just say that on his various trips to the South Pacific, including Tahiti, where he ended up making his most famous paintings are from his trips, his visits to Tahiti. And then he'd stay there for months, maybe a year. He, let's just say, was a pedophile. I don't know any other word for it. I mean, we're talking about 13, 14, 15-year-old female members of these villages. And of course, these were French colonies. Even back then, though, the laws would have prevented him from doing it, but he was never actually forced to face any criminal charges. But he died of syphilis, so maybe that's poetic justice. Well, in the meantime, the one thing you could say, though, is positive about these paintings in relation to the native culture is he did respect their beliefs, even if he couldn't adopt them or find comfort in them. He was a cynic and a depressive himself. Not manic depressive, that's a big difference. Just chronically depressed because he didn't believe in anything except himself and his talent. So what do we see here? We see their God, one of their many gods, of course, but maybe the most powerful one, which is on a rock overlooking a stream, right? Or an inlet, perhaps it is an inlet or bay from the ocean. And look at the colors. These are spirits from the other world, symbolized by these different floating patches of color, or blobs really of color. but mostly he's focusing on the people being happy, healthy, and content. And he envied them that, and he could never feel that way. So in that sense, he at least did respect that native culture's ability to have a fulfilling belief system, and having, happy, healthy lives, which he was not capable of. So this is a mother with two of her kids, on the sand here, and then we see these other villagers coming in from the shoreline here, and their boat. It's a beautiful scene, quite beautiful, and it is typical of his. The concept here is the belief of these people, though he didn't feel it, in a higher power, a god, some kind of meaning to life that he never could share. And you see the bold, vivid, unreal colors, of course, and the bold outlines with the soft, realistic modeling. And here, there's scientific perspective. There's a vanishing point. There's overlapping, obviously. There is diminishing size. And I would say there's some foreshortening on that rock here, and to some degree, on the shoreline, some foreshortening as well. And then the color is mostly warm in the foreground on the skin tones, the sand, and even most of the blobs of color in the water. Cool mostly in the background of the ocean, the sky, the mountains, and the clouds. The largest mass, probably the sand here, this little hill, sandy hill, I guess, if you count that as one mass. And then it's a close call between the mother who's closest to us and the statue of their god. And after that, you could just decide whether these are the same. So these two figures of two females coming in with some food, right, on trays, and two women dancing here. They would be, I guess, equally the third largest masses. Is there a distortion of proportion here? I don't see it here. Not really, because there's no object that we can say clearly is not within itself or scale between two objects that's altered. So it's fairly realistic in that regard. And it is balanced. I would say absolutely. These trees, the clouds and the hills, the statue and the mother are in the middle ground, dead center. And to me, the sky with the clouds has mass along with the water. So I would say it's also balanced top to bottom and left to right.
Would you say the texture is simulated?
Here, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I'd say on both this and the previous, no, it's implied. Yeah, because here on the tree trunk, you notice it's soft and diffused. So you could say it's implied simulated texture. It's more realistic on the three human figures closest to us, the mother and her two, I think they're both boys, two sons, or two children. There's some, you could say there's simulated texture on the closest human figures, but overall, most of his paintings and the rest of this painting is just implied textures. Even on the mountain, you see that here, right? And the shoreline and the rock that the statue's on. Okay, are we overlooking anything? I think we've covered everything. It's dynamic and mostly dynamic on the foreground, but stable, you'd have to say, on these figures, because they're right angles to each other, the mother and the two children, and the sculpture is mostly stable, as are the two groups of women that are in the middle ground. So it's a mixture of stable and dynamic. And I think we've covered, all the main techniques. All right. So I'm going to stop the share and take any questions if anybody has any about, well, obviously either anything we just covered, or remember the exam. This is really important. You need to be logged in by about 3:10 so that there's only one slide and it's an essay format, and you'll have a whole hour to look at it, and then you will be able, it's not being recorded, it's real time, because I can't make an uneven playing ground, between the real in-person class, where they have just an hour to do that. And then if they need more time, and you do too, of course, they can then continue to work after the slide is off the screen. But it'll be plenty of time to do the formal analysis and the meaning. I sent everybody a PDF of the test sheet itself. And obviously, if you're going to hand print your answers, you're going to need some more blank paper, because one sheet won't be enough, certainly not to get a passing grade. So you need to write 3 to 4 pages total, roughly equal, or half on the meaning and half on the 10 elements of composition, all of which is in the things I already sent you guys as PDFs. And then you'll have till midnight to submit them as a PDF, the completed answers, or what it is, just not answers. And there's no True, false. There's no, bibliography. Of course, you wouldn't be expected to do that when you're just looking at a single slide and doing it in real time. So no bibliography, no in-text citations, but you do need to cover all 10 of the elements of composition in detail, as well as a page and a half or two full pages on the meaning. 4 slides I already put in the list. So one of those 4 will be the one you'll see when we do the actual test. So be please online logged in by about 3:10 at the latest. Okay, we've covered pretty much everything, and that will be on Wednesday, 2 days from now. So you should be getting your notes together if you haven't already for those 4 slides that I sent in that short list. Anybody have any questions at all about anything I just mentioned or about the slides we saw today? I think you can see how interesting those topics were we covered, Van Gogh alone, but Seurat and Gauguin, at least one, maybe 2 of those slides we just saw will be on the final. Okay, one more call for anybody have any questions. Of course, I'll check my email tomorrow, but not before the test. I'll be in transit because that's in my office. I give that, as I always do. The Wednesday lectures are actually on my laptop at Santa Rosa campus. I won't have time to check my email before, but tomorrow I will, up until about 8 p.m. or so, if you have any further questions. All right, one more time. Anybody have any questions you can answer? Okay, you guys, good luck on the test. I'll see you all hopefully shortly after 3, certainly no later than about 10 after, so you'll have maximum time to write about the one slide that will be an essay format. Okay, you guys, take care.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See you on Wednesday. Good luck on the test.